Welcome to this presentation on writing a thesis proposal. Right, where to start? Often students find writing a proposal quite overwhelming, and this is not surprising because research is about taking the very complex world and trying to simplify it. So it is necessarily filled with chaos, doubt, and confusion. So if that's what you're feeling, just be reassured that this is a normal part of the process. And you're at the beginning of a process. So as you work through your research project, you will become more familiar with the literature, you will become more familiar with the research methodologies, so you'll gain confidence as you move through it. But at the beginning, of course, it's much more difficult because you're starting to learn this whole process. And developing a proposal is the first step in this process of simplifying the complexity in order to make sense of it. The research proposal is never really perfect because it's an idea of how you want this research to take place, and how it plays out might be very different in the end. But it's something that you can then, the proposal helps you think through what you think you're going to do, and then you can adjust it along the way if necessary. The proposal is a very necessary step, and I think every student should do a research proposal because it really helps you to think through all the nuances of your research project before you begin. So rather than having to change in the middle of things, you can think them through at the beginning. Before we begin and get into what goes into a proposal, I want to just talk about disciplinary differences. So while there are common elements to most research or thesis proposals, there are also differences, and those differences will be based on disciplines or subdisciplines. So depending on your discipline, you might include different sections, you might collapse some of the sections that I'm going to show you, you might have additional things that you need to put into the proposal. So although I'm going to give you the generic kind of research proposal, you will need to go and do research in your department, a faculty, look at examples, and see how proposals in your particular area are structured and what proposal readers are looking for. But what I'll give you are the basics. So just to give you an example, what I'm thinking of here is engineering. So in engineering, the literature review wouldn't necessarily be a separate section. What you would find is that the literature review would be either under the introduction or in the methods section. And the methods section would be a very important part of the proposal. The other difference that I wanted to mention is that PhD level proposals are quite substantially different from master's level proposals, not only in scope and depth, but also PhD level proposals require much more originality and are more theoretically based more often than not. So what is the overall purpose of the proposal? For your proposal assessor, the person who's going to read it, they want to see that you understand the research process, that you understand the content area that you're working in, and that you are able to do this research. For you, the proposal provides a map. It's a guide for you. So as you move forward, you can look back at your proposal and say, what did I want to do here? Okay, yes, I see that's what I wanted to do. Yes, I'm continuing on in that direction. Or no, things have changed, I need to alter my proposal. So it provides you with a pretty good way forward. So these are the generic things that go into a proposal. So these would be the sections that make up the proposal. You would generally have an introduction and background to the problem. You would have some kind of problem purpose statement and questions, a literature review, methodology, data analysis, limitations, so things around the methodology or the methods, some kind of research strategy, and then there could be a range of other optional sections, and these would be a paragraph each depending on what it is, and then a concluding paragraph. I'll go through each of these in turn and explain them a bit more. And this is really for research types of proposals. So if you're doing the kind of proposal like in philosophy, you wouldn't exactly follow this particular format because you probably wouldn't have an empirical research methodology section. So your focus would then be on the literature review. So let's have a look at the introduction and the background to the problem. So the introductory paragraph is very important because this is where you orient your reader to your project. This is where you gradually warm your reader up to the ideas that you're presenting. And in a way, it's a little bit of a summary what's going to come next, but you're sketching the background for your readers. And what your reader's asking is, where does this research take place? When? What is the research about? And the most important question is, why should I read any further? So really what you want to do is interest your reader right up in the first paragraph. The other thing that introductions do is they explain to your reader what's coming next in the proposal. So you can sketch out in a couple of sentences what this proposal will look like so that the reader knows what's coming next. The background to the problem is really the build-up. You're convincing your reader through these multiple layers of arguments why this problem is so important. So here you're providing some general background on the problem. You're explaining why this problem is important. You're explaining what we know about the problem, and that could be in real-world terms, but it could also hint at the literature as well. And you're justifying what we don't know about the problem, and again, that could be in real-world terms, or it could be based on the literature. You're setting up the problem in the background. One of the things that's quite important when you start conceptualizing your research, so what you're doing in developing this proposal is making a whole range of decisions around what you will do and what you won't do, and how you're going to go about doing it and why. So in making these decisions, it sometimes gets quite overwhelming, trying to move from a topic to a research problem. And one of the ways to think about this is to think about what is going to go into the background and what is going to stay in the foreground. So for example, if you take a concept like poverty, poverty is a very important issue, but it may be in the background of a study that has to do with a poor community developing income generating mechanisms. So although poverty is the major problem, the smaller problem that you're going to focus on is how this community, or why this community needs to develop income generating programs. So problems are always interlinked and very complicated in the ways that they are interlinked. So deciding what is on center stage in your study and what will move into the background will help you to decide what you're going to focus on and then what you're not going to focus on. And this is really setting up the scope and the delimitations of the study. What goes into the proposal? This part of the proposal is the problem purpose statement. Now, a lot of people who teach workshops on this or who have videos on this may not set up the problem purpose statement in exactly the same way as I have done here. This is my argument for the need of this kind of problem purpose statements, which I have found very, very useful in workshops. So the way I'm setting up the problem purpose statement here is set up in a particular way, and it's not always set up like this, but it's a way that really works as far as I'm concerned. The problem purpose statement that I'm going to show you it comes from Sharon Merriam, and I have several videos which will take you through the problem purpose statement in much more detail. So have a look on YouTube and see if you can find those videos if this is something that you want to focus on. But what the problem purpose statement is a very succinct, short statement, really no longer than a page, about your research project. It's the core conceptualization of the research project. It should appear within the first 3 pages of the proposal. And you'll find that if you get a question about what is this research about, your reader is looking for that problem purpose statement. So the proposal reader's questions, which will be answered by this, is what is the key problem? What is the knowledge gap? Is there a need for this research? What is the purpose of the research? What are the key research questions? Are they framed as questions? Do the questions align with the problem? Is the scope of the project appropriate? Is the research well conceptualized? And is the study doable? So this is what goes into a problem purpose statement, and I'm really not going to go through it in too much detail here because I do have those other videos. But really it's 1 or 2 sentences of a statement, 1 or 2 sentences on a statement of the problem. And it's quite hard to articulate the problem often. So using the sentence, the problem here is, and finishing that can sometimes help. So 1 or 2 to 3 sentences on identifying the knowledge gap in the literature. A sentence or 2 that provides the context of the study. Where is this taking place? What is the study about? A sentence or 2 about the conceptual framework of the research. Now, this is only relevant if you're doing doctoral research or if it's relevant in your particular field. Now, the logic and evidence refers to the order that these 4 things are presented in. And that order will depend on your topic and on your disciplinary kind of context. So, for example, if your topic is very contextually heavy or contextually bound, then you might begin with the context. If your topic is really based on a knowledge gap, then you might begin with the knowledge gap. So if your problem is a big real-world problem, then you might want to begin with the problem. So how you order all of this will depend on the logic of your research. The evidence refers to the fact that you need to provide sources for, if you can, for the existence of the problem. So convincing your reader that this problem is important will be substantially stronger if you have sources to back that up. And the same thing with the knowledge gap and the other parts of the problem statements. What follows the problem statement is the purpose statement, and this really should have a sentence. The purpose of this research is to. Now, often people think that they shouldn't put that sentence in, and when they don't, the very first question they get is, what is the purpose of this research? So to me, it's very easy to put that sentence in, and then it will be clearly stated. Whatever you use to finish that sentence implies your methodology, and you could add a sentence or 2 that expands on the methodology after the purpose statement. The purpose statement should close the knowledge gap that you identified earlier, and it should state the broad goals of the research. This is then followed by the research questions, and the research questions should unpack the problem you've identified. So you have to go back to those sentences where you identified the problem and draw your questions out of that. And the questions will give you the scope of the project, and they should be framed as questions. If you are developing a hypothesis, you would do it after this. The research questions allow you to really focus the project. So developing the hypothesis after that is a little bit easier than trying to do it before you've developed your questions. Okay, the literature review. This is often one of the most difficult parts of a research proposal because you may not know the literature really well at this point. And again, what I would say to you is just trust that you will get to know the literature much more as you go through this process, and that you have to start somewhere. So what the literature review does is that it situates your research within the broader research literature. So the studies that have been conducted on your topic or problem, what you do with it here is you tell your reader, this is what's been done in this area, and this is where my research fits. And that sets up a rationale for the study because you're identifying a gap, a knowledge gap, and it sets up an academic rationale for the study. You're also evaluating the literature in relation to your particular project. So you're not just describing it, you're evaluating it, and you're saying, although this study was conducted here, this was missing from it. And my study is going to fill that gap. So that's an evaluation. You want to be showing that you have read some texts very deeply and that you have a broad enough overview of the literature. And this is very tricky because in the proposal, the literature review section is not very long. So it's quite a difficult balance. But the more you read, obviously, the more confident you'll be about your project, the more you'll know about it, and it will show in the proposal. But of course, you don't want to be spending years and years working on the literature review of your proposal. So you do need to balance things out. And the other thing you would do in the proposal is explain the conceptual framework. Your proposal reader's questions would be, has the student read enough to inform the study? Is the study situated within the literature? Does the student have a good understanding of up-to-date, very important, key thinkers, issues, debates relevant to the study? Has the student been able to describe, analyze, and critically evaluate what he and she has read? Is the literature review related to the study at hand? So is it relevant? And particularly for doctoral students, is the conceptual framework unpacked in the literature review? So just another comment about literature reviews. Literature reviews essentially describe and analyze the literature. You need both. You need both the description and the analysis. So description would be something like, this particular study was conducted in this place or area. The methodology they used was X, Y, and Z. The results they came up with was A, B, and C. So that's a description, just telling you summarizing in a sense what's happened in that study. Now, analysis would be looking at the individual paper and trying to analyze the consistency of that research project. Or it could also be looking at a number of different papers or articles or book chapters or books and identifying patterns across those texts. So analyzing involves comparing, contrasting, grouping, looking for similarities, looking for differences. So in the literature review, you want to both describe the literature you're reading as well as analyze it. So even grouping things into themes would be a level of analysis. And really what your reader is looking to see is that you are able to move from lower order thinking skills, which is understanding and summarizing readings, to higher order thinking skills, which is then analyzing, synthesizing, and evaluating that literature. So literature reviews must contain analysis as well as description. So what does the literature review do for you? It helps you to situate your study within the literature by identifying the knowledge gap. It helps you to set up the theoretical framework. It could even help you set up the criteria for data analysis. You could have a section in the literature review where you unpack how you're going to analyze this data, if it's relevant. If you are using a particular theorist, what I'm thinking about now is perhaps Foucault and discourse analysis, then you could set up the theoretical framework in the literature review as well as the data analysis, and then later when you analyze your data, your reader will already know what you intend to do. The literature review also helps you to explain your use of concepts. And we're not talking about dictionary definitions here. We're talking about the different meanings within the literature and how people have used concepts. Academic work is always contested. People have different perspectives. There's very often not a lot of consensus. Well, there may be consensus, but there will always be people who argue against a particular issue. So that's why you can't use dictionary definitions, because there will be contested meanings around concepts in the literature. And this is what you really want to show. You want to show the different meanings, and then you want to align yourself with one of those meanings and provide an explanation of why you're aligning yourself in that way. You might also, in the literature review, set up a perspective that informs your methodology if it's important. If you are taking a narrative approach, then perhaps setting up a postmodern narrative analysis in the literature review becomes important to you. And you're also developing an argument, which I'll come back to, about why you have selected these bodies of literature and how they relate to your study. The other thing that's very important in a literature review are the counter-arguments. And this is because scholarly work tries to prevent or tries to avoid looking like you are biased or subjective. So scholarly work tends to want some kind of balance. So if you are presenting only your argument, your perspective, then it's very one-sided. So really what readers like to see is that you have read the counter-arguments and that you have taken note of the counter-arguments and provided a rebuttal in some way to them. So showing counter-arguments is very important in a literature review. For the proposal reader, they want to know that you can situate this research in a literature, that you've been able to read a range of appropriate material and that it's relevant, that you've been able to select from that field and read critically, that you're aware of the intellectual debates, that you can move from lower order thinking to higher order thinking, that you understand the theoretical perspective that you're arguing for, and they want to be convinced by the arguments you're making in the literature review. Just a quick note on reading and note-taking. Literature reviews really involve systematic reading. So setting up some kind of method is really helpful to you and helpful to your reader, so that your reader has confidence that you haven't gone about this in a chaotic way, that you have had some kind of system. And your system could be to start with, for example, a couple of key articles which you read in depth and then trace the sources in those articles, and then read more articles in depth and trace the sources in those articles. So that's starting small and growing bigger. Another method could be doing searches through library databases and on Google for using keywords, tracking your keywords, and just collecting PDFs and documents, books to do with a topic or to do with a research problem. And then once you've collected, then organize them into some kind of system, and then perhaps read all the abstracts, and then finally focus on in-depth articles to read in depth. So what you're doing there is much more of a global search and then narrowing down. So those are the two kinds of ways of reading. The first one is from the narrow to the general, the specific to the general. The other one is from the general to the specific. University libraries generally have the most wonderful librarians, so get help from librarians if you can. They really know their stuff and they can help you enormously. Be very organized in your note-taking, because this is a long-term project. You might be taking notes in year 1 and then use them again in year 4. And by that time, you've forgotten which part of your notes were from the text and which part were your thoughts. So you want to be very clear about, if you take something from a text verbatim, you'll put that in quotation marks with a page number. If you write your own notes underneath that, you'll highlight them or put it in a different font so that it's very clear what comes from the text and what were your thoughts at the time. And that's so that you don't inadvertently plagiarize down the road. Okay, Moving on to the methodology part of the proposal, and this is a very important part of a research proposal. This is the crux of the matter, actually, for your readers. Now, this section will be written differently depending on your discipline. I've called it methodology, but in some disciplines, this would be called research methods. Methodology means, methodology incorporates the philosophy behind the method. Now, in some disciplines, this is not as important, but in qualitative research, this is much more relevant. So the sections that I've got down here would be paragraphs within the methodology section of a proposal. So you would give an explanation of the research paradigm, where you would explain why this paradigm is relevant for this particular topic. You would then look at the research design, which should link to the research paradigm. There should be a logic to it. And you need to explain why this design provides an overarching model or method for your data collection methods. And then in the data collection, what you really want there is the step-by-step process of how you will collect the data. So what will you do first? What will you do next after that? You will also include sections on your population, your sampling method, the research site, anything else that you need to include about the research so that your reader can see that you've thought of all the steps along the way. You might include an ethics section. Not all proposals do that. It's not always relevant, but you might include an ethics section if it is relevant. For qualitative research, sometimes having a section on the role of the researcher is important, and that's because you're trying to address the issue of subjectivity or bias. You would generally want to have some kind of section on how this method will deliver valid data. And you would also perhaps have a section on how you intend to analyze the data. I think it's very useful to include data analysis in the proposal, because you can get feedback on that, and later on when you come to analyze the data, you already have this all set up. Now, in some methodologies, the analysis is set up anyway, so that won't be relative. But in a lot of that won't be relevant. But in a lot of qualitative research, the analysis is not set up ahead of time, and it really is useful to do that. And the last section you might want to include are the limitations. So if for logistical reasons your sample is fairly small, then you want to note that, because really what you're telling your reader is, I understand, I have thought through, I know what the problems are with this, but I still think that it will be a valid research project. And what your reader's looking to see is whether you've thought through all the steps, whether there's a consistency in the research paradigm, design, and data collection, and all of that is related in a consistent way to your research problem. Whether you'll be able to answer the research questions through the data that you've collected. Will you have enough sources of data for the size of your project? If you're doing a doctoral study, will you have enough to complete that doctoral study? Have you thought about the kind of ethical issues, subjectivity issues, validity issues? And really the reader wants to be confident that you can go out and undertake this research tomorrow if necessary. Right, the next section in a research proposal is the research strategy. And this is, again, not one that is included in all research proposals, but I think it's very useful for project planning. And I would suggest that you should do it anyway, even if you don't include it in the proposal. And this is where you set up the timeline for the research. Providing a detailed plan of when you intend to do all the steps. And, people use Gantt charts because you can block out months in those charts. But it gives you a schedule, and it's really useful for keeping to your deadlines that you set yourself, and for helping you manage what really is a big project. There could be a number of optional sections that go into the proposal, and this is really up to you, your supervisor, and your department or discipline. So I would suggest that you go and ask people, look at examples of proposals in your discipline if you can. Ask your supervisor what other sections could be included. Quite a few people like to have a section that says significance of the research. Others might be asked to present the impact of the possible impact of the research. In education, for example, you might be asked to provide implications for practice. But really what your reader wants to know is whether you have provided enough to show that you can go and do this research. So other things you could include perhaps as appendices would be your interview, in-depth interview questions. If you have prepared a survey, you could attach the instruments. You might want to provide descriptors on your population. Those kinds of details that can provide additional information to show that you have really thought this through. You could also order the sections differently. The order of the sections is not quite as important as that they are in there. And then finally we come to the conclusion. Now, although you provide a conclusion although you provide a summary in the conclusion, you really want to use your conclusion to emphasize key points. So you want to emphasize the need for the study more than anything else, so that you can convince your reader. And then, of course, you want to have your references in whatever format is required of you. And what your reader will be looking for is to see, do you have up-to-date sources? Or are your sources all from 10 years ago? And of course, that might be relevant in your topic, but they're going to look for relevant sources to this particular topic. I just wanted to add a slide on arguments in a proposal, because I've given you the sections that generally go into the proposal, but within those sections you are making these arguments. And what I would ask people to do in my workshops would be to take index cards and to write out all these arguments in one sentence, and then to go back to your proposal and see whether those arguments have been pulled through the proposal and whether you've provided evidence for them. So one of the key arguments you're making is that there's an urgent need for this research, and that the research problem is relevant and important. And that could be related to time, that it's relevant and important now, or something happened in the past that makes it relevant and important now. Sub-arguments within the proposal are the knowledge gap. You're making an argument about that there is a knowledge gap and that it needs to be filled, that this methodology is the most appropriate, most relevant, and not another one, and that this conceptual framework is the most fitting lens to view this project. So those are some of the arguments that you need to think through in your proposal. Now, the question I always get in workshops is, how long should the proposal be? And this is, I've put page numbers here, but that is really totally arbitrary, because your particular department or faculty will have a guideline of how long proposals should be. So you need to look that up. What's more important here is the weighting of the proposal. The weighting of the proposal lies in the literature review and the methodology. Now, generally, proposals are quite short documents. They're about 15 pages, maybe 20, when compared to the overall thesis. So the bulk of the focus should be on the literature review, which is setting up the need for the project, and the methodology, which is outlining how you will go about collecting the data. And then the other sections fall in the pages on either side of it. So make sure that when you've written your proposal, that you don't have an overly long introduction and a short methodology. You want to make sure that you've got the weighting right. A quick word on title. The title is very important because that's what people see first. And often people set up their titles before they do their proposal, and then sometimes the proposal shifts and the title doesn't match. So you want to make sure the title matches. In some disciplines, it's important to encapsulate the whole topic in the title, and other disciplines allow for more creativity, more generally focused topics. But really, what I would suggest to you is if someone's going to do a keyword search, how would they find your thesis? What would the keywords need to be? And those keywords need to be in your title. So think about it like that. Okay, I've come to the end of this presentation. I just have some readings for you to look at if you're interested. What I want to end off with is just to say that the proposal can be an overwhelming part of the thesis process. Just to remember that you're at the beginning and that you will become more and more competent as you go through it. You'll become more familiar with the literature. So just take it step by step, break it down into the smallest piece and work on that smallest piece and build it bit by bit until you get it completed. Don't forget to ask other people and your supervisor for help in putting together the proposal. And just another quick note that I have other videos on YouTube, particularly the problem purpose statements, which you can go and have a look at. Just search my name. And just to wish you all the best of luck, and I hope you put together a fabulous proposal.